Welcome back, guys. Moving forward in this lesson, I'm going to talk about the key Lumberyard terminology. So if you're new to working with Amazon Lumberyard, then these key terms will certainly be beneficial to you. If you're an experienced individual, then this is just going to be a reinforcement of your existing learning concepts. So let's dive right in. I'm going to talk about just the basic and the most important Lumberyard that we'll be using as we move forward. So one of the first terms is called an actor. So an actor is basically an entity that you create for characters in your game. Person, or whatever type of person you have, for example, would be an actor. We can then add the animation graph or anim graph, character physics. You can run scripts such as Lua scripts, right? Lua is a programming language. And then various actor components to the entity to control your actor's movements, whether it's idle, walk, run. So an actor component basically exposes all of the nodes or the node itself that Lumberyard uses for animation. And we can work with these nodes within the animation editor. And each of these tools, of course, I'm going to demonstrate as we move forward. Create motion sets that determine the character's motion, like I mentioned, run, walk, idle, and so on. So here's an example actor that you see on the screen. So the entity in the Lumberyard editor viewport has the actor component tag. Now you'll notice there are several properties that you can work with regarding actor, the Lua script, the anim graph, and so forth. Next is the asset builder API and the asset processor. So the builder API is simply an interface for, let's say, creating custom types of asset. With the asset builder API, you can create, for example, your own choice of custom asset and register the asset in the pipeline itself. So the processor then processes the asset like any other file. So if, for example, let's say you have a TIFF file or a DDS file, and that you can use in Lumberyard. The asset processor is simply a background service that monitors changes to any of the files, the updates, the cache, for example, with any changes. So if you replace an existing mesh asset, for instance, with a new version of the asset, it's the job of the asset processor to process the required changes for you. And you'll notice here's an example of importing the assets. So when you import assets in your game project, asset processor automatically detects the change and processes them. The common example that I always give is if you're importing an existing actor, right? So you have your own BX files, for example, and you like to import your assets into the library. Next, we have the AZ code generator. Talked about this in the previous lectures, but here it is one more time. Just a utility which accepts the source code file and creates a text, data, or code file. And it parses through the list of existing C++ source files or header files, and then eventually generates data in JSON form. It will pass the intermediate data to a series of templates, which will then provide the format for the code that is generated. Next is the entity, which is fairly important. So an entity is simply a game object, which has a unique ID and a container. I've talked about this before, but just one more time. It contains one or more components that provides functionality. For example, we can add a mesh component to an entity to add a visual geometry, such as creating a door or tree for your game. So some examples of entities and components, you can see that in the picture itself. So we have the plasma launcher, for example, in the entity outliner, and then the entity inspector has the plasma launcher itself, and then of course the transform properties, whereas the y-axis, the x-axis, and the z-axis. GameLift, just wanted to briefly touch base on this. Amazon GameLift is a service that you can use to host your server-based games. So let's say you develop your brand new game within Amazon Lumberyard and you like to host it somewhere, right? Well, you don't need to go anywhere else. AWS provides a service called GameLift, which allows you to host server-based games, scale servers up and down, allows players to connect, and provides matchmaking services. So it's a fairly elaborate set of service. And you can enable the GameLift gem for Lumberyard. And we talked about gems, right, briefly. These are just reusable packages of code and assets that can be added, modified, or removed from a Lumberyard game. And finally, we have the slice itself. It's simply a collection of configured entities that are stored as a single unit in a reusable asset. So we can store or use these slices, for example, to group entities and other slices for reuse. These are very powerful. So with slices, you can edit, create, and spawn multiple entities as a complete unit or a set. So here's an example of the slice itself. So there's simple Jack locomotion is a slice that contains two entities. You see Jack, an actor, right? The image, person, and then the camera. So both of them are grouped to be reused at any point in time. So I hope this helps. Practice with some of the key terms within Amazon Lumberyard. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And with this, let's move to the next lesson.